Is there a second Cold War unfolding between the US and China? Is NATO still an effective defense strategy? What is the function of the Belt and Road Initiative? These are some of the questions that we'll attempt to answer today in TMO's Global Podcast series. I'm your host, Bence. Let's get started.
Let me introduce our guests today. First of all, we have Arjit, Roshan, joining us from the United States, from George Mason University. Then we have Simba, a student of political science and economics, joining from the Netherlands. Simba has a YouTube channel actually called My Take.
Subscribe.
Be sure to check it out. And then we have here Pelaez, who is joining from Lisbon, Portugal. He's actually working with UN Watch, and he has also been studying and living a bit last year in Shanghai, China. And I am Bence Juhász, president of TMO Association. I'm doing constitutional law this year, and welcome on board. Well, guys, my first question would be going to Lewis, actually. Do you agree with the Cold War framework? Is that applicable to this rivalry between the US and China?
Right. So I think obviously if we're going to use that framework, we need to go back a little bit in history and talk about the original Cold War. So what we had with the US and the Soviet Union, of course, were two very separate spheres of influence, right? We could still talk about the communist versus capitalism or the West, but those are sort of outdated terms as well, because we know that communist China today is communist as a party, but not necessarily in economic terms. So I think the first major difference and the big setback on this theoretical framework is that there is no two separate spheres of influence. And of course, Soviet Union was sort of an empire with satellites, right? And what we have now with China is not even close to that. They can't even sort of get control of so-called their territories like Hong Kong and Taiwan. So I think that framework is definitely a little outdated in that sense. I think that also China is using different methods that aren't going to be, we don't have proxy wars. China's not interventionist. They weren't involved in Syria while, regional powers like Saudi Arabia or even global powers like Russia were involved. So they're not interventionist in military confrontations. There aren't no real proxy wars. We could talk about the China Sea a little later, but there is a new framework that I think that we could use. And maybe you can have a little bit of an analogy with the Cold War, which is more the One Belt, One Road, the economic sort of trade war that we have, and technology, of course. But that's something that we can get into as the talk goes on.
Well, yeah, I think we definitely have already seen this year emerging which areas of the world are going to be battlefield. We just saw that in Hong Kong, democracy has effectively been abolished. And so that in a sense is a victory for China. What was supposed to happen in 2047 already happened, today in 2020. And I think the very next battlefield right now is actually Taiwan. And if you look at Taiwan, just recently, in the last few weeks, there have been massive quantities of arms sales by the United States to Taiwan, and also provocations by China. And generally, you see that Taiwan is sort of positioning itself as this, sort of anti-China bastion, especially in the context also of the coronavirus, calling into question China's response, the fact that China, initially was very slow to inform the world, and these kind of things. And really, you kind of see a militarization. And also in Taiwan itself, look at the domestic politics, anti-China sentiment going up, going up, and pro-independence sentiment also going up. And so generally, I do think that Taiwan is really the next thing to watch. And actually, I'll be talking about that next week on my channel. But indeed, Taiwan is one of the key things to watch. And then for the rest, I would say just globally, wherever there are, sort of clashing economic interests, we see, of course, China, in Africa, but also in Eastern Europe, and really around the world making investments. So that would be the more economic side of the Cold War. But in terms of a military political confrontation, it's really on China's borders. So Taiwan, and to a lesser extent, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia.
Arjit, talking about the ideological and the economic conflict on these two sides of the rivalry, which do you think is the more important, if we can differentiate between the two, or what's your take on the ideological side?
So it's important to know that we're not really facing an ideological enemy in the same way we were facing with the Soviet Union. I really agreed with Luis's characterization of this. These aren't two competing spheres of influence, two competing economic systems. We're operating the same global economic framework. We actually ushered China into this global economic framework. We created the modern China in a sense. Modern China, as we understand today, was created in the 1970s after it adopted the neoliberal framework. So really, we're not facing an enemy, but in a way, a bizarro version of ourselves. It's kind of a bizarro version of state capitalism. If anything, we're trying to see who's the legitimate heir to that system, in my eyes. So, which one's going to present the most legitimate version of market capitalism? Do we have a state-led capitalism which moves people around at the will of the state, rejects human rights, or are we going to have something that the United States has?
But do you think that there isn't really a deep ideological divide between the countries? I mean, thinking about China's relationship to human rights, I think there are severe concerns. And for example, maybe at a later point, but we can talk about Xinjiang region, for example. So I think there could be a severe divide in this regard. Simba? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so in that regard, I think that a lot of it is sort of imagery and posturing. I don't think that there is a serious ideological divide. I think ideology in this sense is merely a way to mobilize people at home. I mean, obviously, China is definitely having a very poor human rights record, but I think generally for both powers, also for the United States, I think it's a truism that whenever there's geopolitical interest, if human rights stand in the way, then it's geopolitical interest that goes first. And I think, if you look around the world, the United States has been behind, a lot of human rights interventions, at least abroad, less so at home. So in that sense, it's the language of human rights and democracy, not so much the practice of it.
I think if I can interrupt here for 1 second as well, I think one of the big mistakes we make is also looking at both of these entities, China or the US, as homogenous, right? So even in the US, you could talk about polarization and not being, this concrete sort of value structure. There's going to be competing values there. So as soon as you sort of start to decouple that, we could talk about, for example, how personally in my experience living in China, I could see that the people there would have very similar values to the people in the US insofar as the everyday goes, right? So even for example, economic developments, they would be more inclined to promote economic developments and less inclined to, have it hindered by human rights, for example. And that's obviously talking about the lower demographic. So when you're talking about the more, as we know from many scholars as well, when you're talking about the better off nations, the more GDP per capita you have, the more inclined you're going to be to enforce these human rights and so forth. At first, as someone put it in China very, very succinctly to me, is that for people that are struggling to put food on the table, what do they care about their freedom of speech? Which I don't personally agree with, but I'm not in that position, So I also see that in the United States. I see that there's a lot of people suffering there, and that they also, they forego the inclination to say that it's bad to put kids in cages and stuff, because ultimately they're saying that those people are costing them money and they're costing their living, because obviously they're bringing wages down and they're illegal immigrants and so forth. So I see that people forego human rights for economic considerations in both countries very often. If you're talking about global rhetoric, just from sitting in the Human Rights Council, I would say that there is significant differences there. China is obviously very anti-interventionist. They try to always talk about, for example, the right to development, the right to, sovereignty and the territorial integrity and so forth. And the U.S. focuses more on the other liberal human rights, right? So freedom of expression, what's going on in Xinjiang, all those kind of mass surveillance, all that traditional things that perhaps us in the West see as human rights, but China does see the importance of certain ones much more than those.
Yes, of course, that's an important perspective of this rivalry, basically, human rights and ideologies. But let's come back to for a second to economic relations. And as you guys mentioned, right now the global economical sphere is just so interconnected, and that's a major difference if we compare this relationship to the U.S. and the Soviet Cold War era. And we also see this sort of economic decoupling. For example, if you look at Huawei, so this technological battle. So the question would be, what is your opinion? Is economic decoupling even possible, or what is your opinion? Should it actually come as a next step in this battle? So Simba, maybe if you can reflect on this.
Yeah, sure. Now, for economic decoupling, I think certainly as a precursor to conflict, it's definitely decades away for there to be any kind of conflict, and indeed decoupling is a requirement for that. But it is something that would, I think, take decades. Even now, we see some slowing down of globalization. We see tariffs being put. We see some protectionist measures being taken. But if you really wanted to talk about cutting off trade to China, that's just something on a scale that no government today would be prepared to do. So I think decoupling is something that could happen, and to some extent is maybe starting now. But it is also something that is it would be a decades-long process of continuous escalation, continuous finding of new and alternative trade routes. And I think the other thing is that it would also be very costly, because at the end of the day, countries do benefit from trade, and it's also very hard to. It's easy to decouple from a small country like Iran, but you can't really decouple totally from the second largest economy in the world, or from China's perspective, from the largest economy in the world. So I think it's something that will always only be partial, because simply that there are too many economic interests at stake.
I agree with Simba. We're not going to see a decoupling, but a really slow bifurcation of global supply chains and global ecosystems. We already see this with social media. We have two kind of social media spheres that are developing. China's WeChat, America and the Western world's Facebook. And we're going to see microchips. As China becomes more independent with microchips, we're going to try and increase domestic investment in our own supply chains.
So I could come in here for a second as well. I think that the decoupling narrative is not going to be to the extent that we actually believe it is. There is no way that these two countries who have become, they're in a symbiosis right now. They both make each other very, very rich, and the rest of the world is the one that sort of is picking up the pieces from that scrap. So I don't think that the U.S. is going to shoot itself in the foot and completely decouple. There's not going to be anything close to the two spheres of influence that there was at the Soviet Union that would make this analogy more true with the Cold War. However, there is a realignment, right? There has been a realignment. I mean, Trump's trade war hasn't been the most effective. I mean, have you seen any changes in China through human rights, for example? No. Through some intellectual property rights, perhaps. However, there was the arresting of the Huawei. There has been the expulsion sort of the Huawei in the American market. But Huawei is also, it's a global, they're not looking just for the US. The US market also, there's a big change happening in China. The US market is no longer going to be the biggest consumer market in the world. China is, and they're becoming, the economy of China is changing from an export-oriented marketing economy, manufacturing economy to a consumer-based economy. So if the US wants to not be also what it tries to say that other countries are communist, or saying that they're going to dictate trading terms and have import subsidies or whatever, then they're going to allow their companies, ultimately the private sector, is going to pressure them into going to China and keep trading with them, because they're the ones that are going to be spending the money on, as we know, the expensive goods. You know this everywhere. We see this in Europe, definitely, where in the most expensive stores, there's always someone there that can speak Chinese to tailor for that public, because they have a lot of money to spend, and the private sector is not going to let that go.
I see. Yeah. In terms of market power, we see also a trend of European countries following the example of the US in terms of decoupling, in terms of technology, for example. Simba, what do you think, together the US and the EU market power, would that be powerful enough to change the course that China is taking?
Oh, certainly if they go together, because those are essentially, China's largest markets, and those are the largest markets in the world. I mean, it is true, of course, that the fastest growing markets are outside of Europe, but even so, I mean, fastest growing doesn't mean biggest. So in that sense, it is true that together Europe and the US do have a lot of power. I mean, just recently, I think it was the Czech Republic was very controversial in its Taiwan policy, which made China very angry, and that's perhaps a signal of things to come. And I think one thing we will see in terms of the decoupling is that certain, let's say, strategic sectors, I think, will decouple. I think the biggest one, the most obvious one, obviously, with coronavirus, is the healthcare sector. That healthcare, manufacturing, making PPE, et cetera, I think many countries have understood now that it's perhaps not, although it might be cheaper to manufacture abroad or in China, that is perhaps not strategically sound, of course, in the event of a global pandemic.
Arjit, from the US, how do you see the North Atlantic relationship? I think I can say from a European perspective that with Trump, there has been a breaking down of the trust that existed between the EU and the US. Do you see that continuing or improving with the Biden presidency?
I think that a Biden presidency can be very reassuring. I think 4 years isn't enough to repair all the damage and lack of trust. After all, you guys aren't sure if we're just going to elect another Donald Trump in 4 years. But I think that Biden's cabinet, Janet Yellen, Tony Blinken, signals that we're kind of returning to a, Obama era normalcy, for lack of a better word. And I think that Blinken is someone who wants his European allies to believe we're back on the world station. We're back to get into alliances. Biden has signaled that he's going to have a summit of democracies first year of his presidency, and that he's going to basically create a global mission statement for what we want the democracies around the world to do to counter China and rising authoritarianism around the world. And I think that once we start those conversations again, we can start the healing.
I see. So that's an important perspective, this reunion of democracies. And of course, the question of illiberal democracies coming into play in this regard, and talking in Hungary and Budapest, it's of course an everyday reality for me. But the question would really be then that isn't there an ideological battle underlying this rivalry? I mean, we have been talking about democracies versus autocracies and human rights or more communitarian approaches. So what's really the importance of this ideological battle compared to the economic one?
So
Arjit, I see
I wanted to touch on that if I could really quickly. It's important to see why this won't be primarily an ideological battle, and it's going to be something more about real politics. Is because one of our major allies in countering China will be India, and India is an illiberal democracy. We might be constrained in how we talk about human rights when we're talking against China, because if we're going to say, hey, it's because they're putting Uyghurs in camps, India's doing the same thing with their Muslim population. They're stripping them of human rights. One of our major strategic allies is an illiberal democracy, does not have a good record on human rights right now, and we really need them for basically anything we want to do. They're going to be the biggest market. India is going to see population growth, explosive growth, around the same time that China's plateaus. So that's going to be very important. Biden and Kamala Harris have been very careful in maintaining this dual constituency at home, whether it be the Muslims and the Hindus. On the Kashmir issue, they've kind of dual signaled hey, we're not going to interfere with you, but we want to say that we support Kashmiri human rights. They've said some soft things against Modi's authoritarianism, but they don't want to alienate the Hindu community here because Indians have the highest median incomes here. They're politically pretty influential now, and they're a pretty important voting bloc. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
It's interesting as well to note that a lot of the Hindu supporters in the U.S. are Trump supporters in the U.S., right? There's that big Modi-Trump sort of I don't know, love affair going on that people have mentioned.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the first questions you mentioned, Ben, was about potential battlefields. And so if we're talking about, this also ties into NATO, if we're talking about, Taiwan is important. The US did just approve $1 billion of arms to them, but I don't think there's going to be ever, full confrontation there. I think that more importantly, you have India, where there has been already rising tensions in the Himalayas. And India is an ally. It's not part of NATO, and neither is Mongolia, for example. I was surprised to know this, but they have a certain preferential treatment or treaty, some kind of defense contract with NATO. So they do have certain assurances, nothing like Article 5 NATO member, but they are sort of in an alliance. So I think that seeing that sort of unfold is going to be interesting. And yes, Trump approached China in a very aggressive way with the trade war and so forth, but ultimately he did not help the alliance of Japan, Philippines. He sort of abandoned those, and I do hope to see Biden realign those and reestablish those. However, it's important to note that Philippines, for example, felt completely abandoned under Obama. So Obama, there was this island, it's called the Sumba Strait or something like that. And China sort of aggressively overtook it. It's about 300 kilometers away from Manila. And Obama did nothing about it. So what did Philippines do? It obviously started aligning and negotiating with China. So it negotiated with China. China did the One Belt, One Road, which ties now into the autocracy versus democracy sort of thing. And they pretty much, the One Belt, One Road is just trying to, we're going to give you some money, some investment, and then you let us do what we want to do with either a port, or in this case, it was an island. And in general, China has this kind of winning formula, which is about economic legitimacy, right? So they know that not everyone in the country of 1.4 billion people are going to like the Communist Party. The Communist Party is not all of China. We have to also make that sort of distinction here. But through economic legitimacy, they have gained in, 93% or more, maybe 99 officially, right? Approval rating. Other countries like that model. So China is sort of exporting that. It's saying, we're going to give you this investment. They do only hire Chinese labor. China is probably benefiting much more from the relationship. However, they are focusing on trying to realign maybe democracies, non-established democracies, illiberal democracies, and aligning them more with the hierarchy or system of China. So that is a different kind of Cold War that we could talk about.
Simba, you mentioned already the South China Sea conflicts, and now with Kashmir and all of this. So what's your opinion on these proxy conflicts basically surrounding China? And what do you think that traditional U.S. allies in Asia, such as Japan or South Korea, what's going to be their course in the following decade, for example?
Yeah. No, I think there's several points to consider. I think everything that happened basically with Trump in terms of escalation was not necessarily unique. It was merely an escalation or an acceleration of things that were already happening. I mean, just look at the South China conflict that was already happening under the Obama administration. In fact, it was Obama who started reorienting the US more away from the Middle East and more towards East Asia, which was probably a better move on his part. And so indeed, Trump has merely accelerated. However, I think the key strategic mistake, I think, of the Trump administration indeed has been alienating allies, because precisely in these times, the basic US strategy against China is basically to surround it. China is actually a nation surrounded. If you think about it, on every side, it has hostile states. It's got India, it's got, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, all US allies. But if you look at some of the sort of the rhetoric or some of the policies that Trump, engaged in with some of those allies, for instance, Korea insisting that, the South Koreans should pay America for protection, these kinds of, aggressive moves are the kind of things that embarrass national leaders, and that makes it harder for them to try and cooperate with the US. And so even though it might look tough in terms of, rhetoric, it kind of achieves the opposite, because it makes it tougher for the US actually to cooperate, and it destroys a lot of the soft power and goodwill that the US has been able to accumulate. And so in that sense, in terms of Biden, I think things have changed forever. I think already in Europe, countries are realizing that they cannot rely on the US fully as an ally or as some sort of protector in terms of NATO. I think, for instance, the move to establishing a European army, whether people agree with it or not, there's going to be more forces moving towards those kind of things. And Europe is already adopting a more independent foreign policy, as we saw with the Iran deal. Trump pulled out, Europe refused to. So, and I think also the allies in East Asia will realize that they need to do the same. Japan is attempting, and unfortunately they failed. Shinzo Abe failed, but they wanted to rearm. And similarly, Taiwan is also arming itself.
A major country that we haven't mentioned yet is of course Russia. So Arjit, what's your opinion? How do you see the role of Russia in this conflict? And of course, for me, Russia is right here in the neighborhood. So what Simba you mentioned about the European army, it could be, I think, a potential step forward, but probably that would still happen under the NATO alliance, I think. But coming back to Russia, what's your opinion on the role of Russia? I mean, is Russia an ally of China? Is it an adversary of Europe? What's their role in this conflict? Arjit, if you could reflect upon this a little bit.
Well, Russia isn't necessarily an ally of China. I don't think this is like Soviet Union era like solidarity. I think Russia's number one role in this conflict is to really present the biggest challenge to a more united NATO, more united Europe. I actually don't know. I want to hear Simba's thoughts on these.
Yeah, Lewis, go ahead.
Sure. I think that, yeah, Russia for sure is not per se an ally of China. China, as Simba mentioned, it does have border disputes with 17 countries. And I think some islands that are disputed between Japan and Russia and China somehow getting in between there as well in the sea up there. But more importantly, there's a history behind that as well, right? So China was, I don't know if betrayed by Russia I think it was right before the Cultural Revolution, but the Russian troops did come in and they didn't provide the logistical support and all the rest that was needed. They basically took what they wanted and got out. And ultimately, the nomencultura system that Russia had tried to instill in China, it just didn't work out, right? So there is a better relationship in the past between the two countries, and they have very different geopolitical aims. So Russia is a prick in the nose to a lot of countries. They like to aggress. I mean, we talk about Syria, we talk about Crimea. With Russia, I think there is a very Cold War still going on. We still have the strict definition of proxy wars going on, whether it's in Syria or in Ukraine. The U.S. is arming the Ukrainian army as well. So there is sort of that there. Even in CAR, there's other places in Africa where that's happening as well. But China likes to. They had a saying, I think it's so Teddy Roosevelt has that saying, like, walk with a big stick, talk soft and
walk with a big stick.
Exactly. So China sort of learned from that as well. And Deng Xiaoping, right before Xi Jinping, he was talking about how, we don't want to show the belly of the beast. We don't want to show the size of the beast right now. We want to be quiet, stay in our lane, and then let the power come to let the investment, let the power, let the growth happen, and then we can start flexing our muscles. Even if he doesn't even mention about per se flexing the muscles, only if there's an aggression against them. So I think China has this different philosophy in the global arena that Russia certainly does not have, and China doesn't like that Russia does those things. I think that ultimately it puts a bad name on everyone because it groups them all together often, right? Because the U.S. sometimes just needs someone to blame, and they want to be. There's a lot of war hawks in the U.S. that want to find something to do and to intervene in the world. So I think that that's something that China looks against, and they've focalized this profusely at the Human Rights Council, as do all countries, so non-aligned movement countries. So,
Simba, what's your reaction to these comments by Lewis?
And I think there's 2 points basically that I'd like to raise. Is number one, Russia is really an overblown threat, and I think it's overblown partially in the US because there's, of course, a military industrial complex that has an interest in creating fear of a Cold War with Russia. Also, I think we may have lost Arjit. In any case, Russia is not the Soviet Union. If you look economically, Russia is basically Italy with nukes. Russia is not nearly as scary as we think. That being said, of course, for countries directly bordering Russia, it's a different story. And we also see that because the US has basically been pulling back, we really see Russia stepping in. And I think the clearest thing is if you look the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which was recently sort of resolved, basically that's happened entirely. I mean, the US was not involved basically in that conflict. Russia entirely directed things there.
And Turkey.
Yeah.
And Turkey as well. But again, that's another evidence as well. What you see, Turkey is becoming its own regional power. And if you look at, for instance, the conflict between Turkey and France, they're both NATO allies. This probably wouldn't have happened with a more active USA. And then just to respond to the point about China, is I don't believe that China, I believe that for a long time China did speak softly and carry a big stick, but not since the coming to power of Xi Jinping. If you look at China, during the Trump era and, the increasing alienation of US allies and a more sort of aggressive rhetoric from the USA, China had, instead of being smart and, just giving, softly, being soft and carrying a big stick and really approaching those countries that felt isolated, they decided to basically copy Trump's tactics, blame the USA for the coronavirus, be very sort of hostile and aggressive with some of the neighboring states, with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, when this would have been the time for them to quietly assume the role of global leadership, which they failed to take the opportunity.
For example, on the coronavirus, that's interesting. I don't see how they blame the U.S. Maybe on the handling of the coronavirus, right? So they don't.
No, they said it was a U.S. conspiracy. The U.S. military created coronavirus.
Who said this? Who said this? The Chinese official spokespeople.
The foreign minister equivalent in China that engaged with this narrative. And so I just one perspective that I want to bring in that also connects to China and Russia is the misinformation and the manipulation, and which is also, of course, in this 21st century, in the age of you could say surveillance capitalism or just the general surveillance both in the West and in China. That's, I think, a major factor of influencing how people think. But so coming back to Lewis, what was your reaction to Simba's points?
No, just about the coronavirus, I don't think it's a public policy or publicly acknowledged. Maybe just like in the US, they have, Trump says a million random things blaming this and that and that, but I don't think it's public policy that they think that there was biological warfare, that the US planted this coronavirus, which ultimately has been killing much more. It's been way worse for the US. China has already recovered, has already beat the virus. They're doing fine compared to the U.S., compared to the rest of the Western world. So I don't think that that's the narrative that at least is public policy in China. But yeah, that point now distracted me from the bigger picture of what we were talking about. But nonetheless, it's important.
If we come back to the coronavirus a little bit, so of course the very source of the virus is unknown, which of course opens up the question to a lot of uncertainty surrounding this issue. But as Lewis, you mentioned, China is sort of recovering, well, at least apparently recovering from the virus. So the question would be that on the medium run, how would the coronavirus affect this rivalry between the US and China?
One of the things that I've definitely seen is a lot more open hatred of Chinese in the US, for sure. I just saw a tweet today from a senator, I believe a congresswoman, a Republican congresswoman, of course, and she talked about how the Chinese have been lying and stealing for 5,000 years. And, that's all obviously follows an onslaught of other sort of attacks. And personally, just having been in China, I definitely don't see that against Americans in China. Of course, there's difference between the everyday people and the governments, but I don't see that sort of personal hatred and so forth, or bigotry in China. Of course, also in China, they're much more. They're less, I don't know, freedom is the right word, but they're less individualistic, maybe not even the right word, but less extroverted. They're more, they're more mannered in a sense. That's already coming back from thousands of years, perhaps, of tradition maybe it's sort of communism, Confucianism, whatever, but they know their place a little better. In the U.S., they are a little more aggressive, I believe, in rhetoric as well. And the coronavirus has only proven that, has only shown that has only exacerbated that exponentially. And ultimately, I think it's a pandemic that all countries are responsible for. They all could have done better in their management of it, and they all could have funded the World Health Organization more, and so forth. The World Health Organization is another topic we can discuss, whether it was subdued indeed by China and whether we could trust it and so forth. However, ultimately, the U.S., leaving, like, for example, the UN Human Rights Council, or trying to leave now the world, or I think they stopped funding the World Health Organization. That's not what helps here. Just with human rights, if the US leaves, then China and these countries are the ones that take the role. And in the Human Rights Council, all we hear now, because I was attending the last session, all you hear is the rhetoric of Cuba, China, and they're winning, they're overpowering, because all you have left there is some Australia and Canada, and then European states, and there's not many of them also on there. So it's a losing battle if we go this way. I don't think that the withdrawal of these global institutions is the right approach.
I also want to bounce off that. It asks hard questions about our priorities in these international institutions, like why, if Taiwan was most effective in responding to coronavirus and China started it, why is China in the World Health Organization and not Taiwan? And obviously it's because of real political reasons, but it kind of shines a light on those absurdities and makes it hard to legitimate at home.
Yeah, certainly.
So, Simba, how do you see China's influence in the UN or WHO, for example? So, just one statistic that I want to raise is that even though the US stopped funding the WHO, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation still continues to do so. And as far as I know, their amount financial support is like 5 times bigger than what the US as a country was supporting the WHO with. So just as a fact, curious fact. But Simba, what is your view on the influence of China in the UN or other global institutions?
Yeah, I think the influence in the institutions mainly has to do with its influence in the various countries. I mean, many people are talking about the Chinese money in the WHO as the source of their influence, but that's not really true. The US provided way more money. I think to look for the source of Chinese influence, you'd better look at China's relationship with Ethiopia, for instance, because of course the chief of the WHO is from Ethiopia, a country with strong relations to China. And similarly with the UN, I think the main source of China's influence is, of course, its bilateral relations with various, often African states, who, of course, it's one country, one vote. And so through China's investment in those countries, it's gotten those countries, of course, to vote in China's favor on a variety of UN resolutions. So I would look at it more that way as a source of China's, as a product of China's influence on other countries.
And so what is the role of the Belt and Road Initiative in this? Is that the engine of this whole gaining of influence, or is that really more just a genuine economic relationship between these countries? And yeah, what is the future that Africa can look forward in this regard? I mean, you don't see many European or American investment there compared to the Chinese ones. So I see, Louis, you're shaking your hands.
Yeah, I mean, originally I would think that the Belt and Road is economic. I've perhaps even argued it in this podcast we're doing a little earlier on. However, I think that we can't overstress enough the geopolitical implications of the Belt and Road. So, for example, you don't need the Belt and Road in Australia for Australia and China or for Australia to depend 30% of its exports to China, right? So Australia is already at the whim of China in many ways, and it's a big problem for them right now, specifically. But they don't need the Belt and Road for that. And many other countries, such as the US as well, also is highly dependent on China, and they don't need that for that sort of leverage. The Belt and Road, however, has been very strategic in its in developing trade routes, specifically nautical trade routes, and for example, they have a new port in Djibouti where the U.S. has a military base there. So the U.S., runs the world with its 180 military bases all across the world, and China having these strategic ports which can be retrofitted into military bases or at least used for docking stations for the aircraft carriers, whatever it could be. That is a very important geostrategic consideration that goes beyond economic needs. So in Africa, they do have some other countries that they are investing in dams and stuff. Ethiopia, for example, has a huge, they have this huge dam that they're trying to build. China is also helping it. There's supposed to be only the country's dam, right? It's their pride now, and it involves Egypt and also some other geopolitical allies in the region. But China has been helping them, for example, in pursue the so-called water rights of our water in the UN Human Rights Council. So they do align on certain things, and it's a tit for tat sort of system could be for China's advantage.
So before I collect your closing remarks, I would like to add that from Hungary, for example, we see a lot of Chinese investments as part of the Belt and Road. And as far as I see, and as far as independent media covers the issue, it really is favoring, state corruption. But that's also just my perspective. So just to collect your closing remarks, maybe Arjit, we can start with you. After this discussion and a little reflection on these issues, do you still maintain your position that the framework of the Cold War is not really applicable to this situation? And what's your final opinion on that?
I don't think it's comparable to the Cold War to the Soviet Union. And my closing remark would be that whereas I think the Cold War with the Soviet Union mostly brought out the worst elements of the United States in terms of foreign policy, we had a bunch of proxy wars. And it brought it, and at its height, it brought out the worst domestically with, like lots of counterculture movements, the 60s. I think a prolonged period of strategic competition with China can actually bring out the best of us on both fronts. We're not necessarily competing with a fully rival economic system, but a system we ourselves have furnished. An ugly, bizarro version of ourselves, as I've said. Competing with China forces us to consider how we want to be better than that and reflect and remember how we are better than that. And if increased competition with China forces us to reorient our foreign policy towards human rights, encourage us to be more generous at home, spurs a massive domestic investment into microchips, technology, give us a competitive edge, then that's a kind of strategic competition I'm here for. I think that's something that'd be good for the country.
Okay, Simba?
Yeah, for me, I would, to some extent, question the degree to which this is, even truly a fair fight. If you think about it, we're talking about a rising China, but we also forget that to some extent there are, some fundamental issues that China has that would probably undermine actually some of its ascendancy. If you look, China has massive demographic problems. It has an aging population. So it's not really an expanding country in that sense. Also, economically, some are fearing that China is going to fall into the middle income trap. So in other words, the wages in China are getting actually too high for it to really to be a center of cheap labor manufacturing. So if it can make that transition successfully, maybe so. But there are many factors actually that are actually to China's disadvantage. So China really is playing with a handicap in that sense. And then in terms of a Cold War, of course, it's not the same as the Soviet Union. And I think that's positive in the sense, of course, during the actual Cold War, there were many more civil wars than today. You can literally put this on a graph. And in this sense, the simply economic competition, I would say, is maybe even slightly positive. If you look, for instance, in Africa, many countries were, totally monopolized by one power. For instance, France having total, economic dominance over those countries, even after independence. But by introducing China, you introduce competition between different powers, which allows all these third countries to gain actually a better deal. So in some sense, it could actually be, a positive development for the rest of the world.
It's nice that you are both optimistic. Let's hear what Lewis has to say.
No, I'm not going to be pessimistic here. I'm not going to play devil's advocate. I agree with what both of them said. Arjit specifically, when he talked about the idea that it's going to bring the best of us, I think that it does mean that on the ideological front, it's going to mean that we're going to have to prove why our system is better than China's, because China is a formidable competition. In the economic front, however, there are some genuine progress that we can do, intellectual property, these things. But China is a state capitalist country, right? So the US is not, and its corporations are not competing on fair ground. Of course, the US corporations also don't compete on fair ground, period. I mean, they have tax evasions, they have also state subsidies, blah, 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 blah. So there is a problem in the world economy, the world economic system that needs to be fixed. I don't know if this is going to be the fix of it or if it's going to be worse, because now the US is going to have its own state subsidized counterparts to counter China, right? So it depends if you are here for the true private free market or if you want this sort of state run enterprise kind of competition. But ultimately, either or, I think that's there could be progress. I want to be optimistic here, and I don't think that it could fit into the narrative of the Cold War, where we're going to have proxy wars, military aggregations. We didn't talk about the South China Sea, which is an interesting place where you could have some sort of physical contact, but I still don't think that it's going to lead to anything substantial. For example, if you just consider Vietnam and what it was in the Cold War, and if you could try to do some kind of comparative to Korea, there is none, because with nuclear weapons the game has changed as well. And also on the military fronts, there is no competition between the US and China. The US has 6,000 plus nuclear warheads, China has 300. However, what Simba was talking about with China, falling into the middle income gap, I don't think that could be the case. I think that they have invested enough into research and development. They're leading, for example, in military satellites and AI and all these sort of developments. They're really on their game on that. And if that is the future, I think that they will be able to forge a genuine competition for the US. Again, though, this is going to be state-run competition. So that is a big problem.
Thank you, gentlemen. And of course, a major issue that we haven't touched upon is climate change. And of course, there is a lot of space for cooperation between these two superpowers. So I guess we all hope that they will indeed normalize their relationship and make it a fruitful one. Well, Simba, Arjit, and Lewis, thank you again for appearing on our podcast, and I hope we can continue the discussion at a later point soon. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for hosting us.
Bye-bye.